While we're waiting for some more people to come, I'm going to just toss up a tactic for today. You can start to look at it and ponder. In this one, you're on the negative side, faced with what you should do in the 2NC, and it is topicality themed, and I'll go over it more in a minute.
Give a quick intro in case anyone wasn't here yesterday. This is Casey Harrigan. He is a national championship winning coach and former winner of the national debate tournament. He coaches for the University of Kentucky and Glenbrook North. And today, unlike yesterday, he is going to talk about topicality. So very excited for that.
Should I get started here, Michaela, or are we waiting for more people?
Your call. My guess is that more will filter in, but that's on them in part. So up to you.
Okay, I'll just get started. The tactic will take the first couple of minutes anyway, and so people won't miss too much of the main content. I am going to be talking about how to get good at debating topicality. I would not claim to be an expert on very much as it relates to the criminal justice topic, although I will be using examples from this topic. But for the most part, my lecture is thematic, designed to talk to you all about just the concepts that underlie topicality and generally how to best execute extending the argument when you are on the negative side. And the structure of my lecture is going to begin with beginner level concepts. Then I'm going to move to some intermediate concepts, and then I'm going to move into some more advanced concepts. And so hopefully it will build, and somewhere along the way it will meet where you all are. And I am going to start here with a tactic. As you can see in this example, just like we have yesterday, we have a set of arguments that I have flowed in my Excel sheet. Hopefully you all can see it. If you cannot, say something. And in this tactic, the 1NC has read topicality enact means that the plan must be done through Congress. And as you can see there's their 1NC. And then there is a 2AC here. And the arguments made by the 2AC are: we meet, the plan is only Congress. 2, counterinterpretation, enactment refers to judicially created rules of procedure. 3rd, they have some reasons to prefer their counterinterpretation, afflex and education. And 4th is reasonability. And if you don't know what any of those arguments mean, don't worry, I'm going to go over them in depth. But in this example, does anyone have ideas about how the negative, like how the negative can exploit this set of answers made by the affirmative? You can either unmute and just say something, or you could type it into the chat. Richard says, could we concede the we meet and then read an agent counterplan? That is good thinking. We definitely potentially could if they said that the plan does mean something that adds some more context that establishes the basis for counterplan competition. Absolutely. I had in mind something slightly more devious, though. And oh, looks like Benjamin is onto it. Okay, so as Benjamin said, if they're Congress, then they don't meet their counterinterpretation. There is some tension between the arguments that the affirmative has made. On the first argument, they said that they are Congress. On the second argument, they said that being Congress is not topical, that enactment only refers to judicially created rules. Now, most commonly, when you hear of someone like double turning themselves, meaning that they both read a unique link turn and an impact turn, that's referring to a debate involving a disadvantage. Similar things can occur, though, and topicality debates, as in this case, where the affirmative has made a set of arguments that can be nearly in their collectivity conceded by the negative and add up to the negative winning. So in this instance, the negative could say, topicality, we're not going for our 1C interpretation, but we'll concede that they are only Congress, and we'll concede their counterinterpretation that congressional action is not topical, thus the plan is not topical, and we'll concede the reasons why their interpretation is best. It is the only interpretation that is desirable, and then you simply need to answer reasonability, arguably, and then that's the end of what it is that you need to be saying. All of the other affirmative arguments are conceded because they, in their entirety, add up to a reason why the plan is not topical. Liam asks, how would the 1AR recover from this? Okay, well, to begin with, there are some things that are irrecoverable. Like if I were to give you a sample 2AC against a disadvantage that said, it's not unique. Let's say we're talking about politics, and they were to say, 1, it's not unique, it won't pass now. 2, the plan is popular, which builds political capital. 3, 4, 5, 6 are all impact turns. It is a relatively tough thing to come back from the fact that you've straight double turned yourself, and that there's no argument that is like a defensive argument that you can extend in the 1AR. In that instance, the way to recover is simply to try to outweigh the argument, or to try to re-explain one of the arguments that you have said in the debate earlier as something different than a straight double turn. And in this instance, my recommendation would be to try to, there's 2 things that you could do in the 1AR to try to escape from this. They may not be successful. Number 1 is to try to recharacterize an argument that was said in the 2AC. Either you can recharacterize number 1 by saying, our we meet argument is not necessarily that the plan only is Congress, but the plan could be Congress, and thus maybe it's also the court, so it's more like it could be topical. Or to recharacterize your counterinterpretation to say, instead of enactment refers exclusively to judicially created rules of procedure, that it includes judicially created rules of procedure, but also includes actions of Congress, meaning that it's not exclusive. Then you would meet that counterinterpretation, and thus it's not like a topicality double turn. So you can try to recharacterize either arguments number 1 or 2, or you can try to extend and aggressively defend the defensive arguments, which in this instance, potentially reasonability could be a thing that could be a defensive argument where you'd say, yes, perhaps we are Congress and we've said that congressional action is not topical, but it's still a reasonable interpretation to allow congressional action, and reasonability is a better frame for evaluating topicality than competing interpretations, which is something that I'll talk about in a second. And that would be a thing that you could do if you were to double turn yourself on a DA, for example. Like if you were to make 7 arguments, 3 of which are uniqueness, link turn, and impact turn, in the 1AR, your focus could be on the defensive arguments, the ones that take out both the original disadvantage and your double turn as the way to try to attempt to recover. But like I think I was implying before, the easiest way to avoid this problem is just to be careful with crafting your 2AC to not get yourself into problems like this to begin with, because as I've demonstrated, they create relatively simple ways for the negative to create a lot of pressure on the 1AR, because when the negative is simply conceding arguments that the affirmative has introduced, it doesn't take them very much time to extend this argument in a devastating fashion, and it requires a lot of time in the 1AR to extend it. All right, so moving beyond the tactic and getting into the heart of the lecture, I am going to, as I mentioned, talk about how to get good at topicality. And we're talking about mostly on the negative side, how to extend topicality. And feel free to type questions into the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask if you have any questions along the way where you'd like me to stop and address anything. I just want to make it really clear that I'm more than willing to address questions as we go. Starting with some beginner concepts. Topicality is a frequently misunderstood idea, which is a lot of people think about topicality as arguments about what the topic means. Instead, I would encourage you to think about topicality as arguments about what the topic should mean, which is, it sounds similar, but there is an important distinction between the two, between what the topic means and what the topic should mean. When you're talking about what the topic should mean, you are acknowledging that there are multiple different ways to interpret the topic. That should probably be obvious, but it is a point that bears emphasizing, which is there are different ways that one could understand establish, or could understand criminal justice reform, or could understand each of the topic areas like sentencing or policing. It does not mean that there's just one, that you are trying to say that there's one singular correct way of understanding the topic and that the affirmative does not meet that. Instead, you're trying to say that inevitably there's disagreement about meaning, but that one meaning is preferable to another, and within that construction of meaning, the affirmative case is not included. All right. There are a few different parts to the topicality argument. You've probably seen these before, but I'm going to go over them just for the sake of just making sure that everyone's on the same place here. And I'm going to use an example here in order to go over this. Let's see. One moment. Let me pull up the file that I would like to be using here. On this note, did everyone get the file that I sent to Michaela, the topicality file about arms control being quantitative? If someone would just type into chat whether you got that, that would be helpful, because it is going to be something that I'm going to be talking about. Yep, everyone got it? Okay, that file is my gift to you all. I don't really know that it'll be all that useful because it's a file related to the college topic last year. But it is, I think, an example of what a fully formed topicality file can look like, that I think you could model your work after in your file construction after over the course of this year. And it does provide an example of all the possible arguments that one could be wanting to be making when thinking through common AF arguments. So, okay, so here's a sample 1NC shell. And I'm gonna just scroll through it quickly. This is an example for T in means within the geographic scope of the United States. We have an interpretation, some evidence, violation, vote neg, and then some reasons to prefer. Okay, so the components of a topicality argument in the 1NC, and this is in the beginner level, I know, but I want to make sure that everyone is aware of what these things mean. The interpretation is your definition of a topic term, what you think the topic should mean. And in this case, the 1NC interpretation, I'll scroll back up, it is referring to both in, meaning within, and the United States, referring to the continental United States, plus Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Virgin Islands, and the Mariana Islands. And then we're saying that that would exclude action in other countries and exclude actions in other parts of the world where the U.S. has sovereign control, like, for example, foreign military bases. Then we have our violation, which is the argument that the plan does not meet this interpretation. In this 1NC, there is an explicit violation. Sometimes the 1NC will not enumerate the violation. It will just be implicit, and that is okay. But I would say that you should include a brief violation. It doesn't have to be evidenced. Anytime that the violation is not facially obvious. For example, if you were debating against a team that read an AF that said the United States Supreme Court should as their plan, and they read a court advantage, in the 1 and C you said enact must be can only be Congress. In that situation, you either could say, after your interpretation, say violation, the plan is the court, which isn't Congress, or you could just leave the violation, you could leave that out of the 1 and C altogether and just say interpretation and then get to vote neg. And I think pretty much every judge is going to understand that the reason that the AF doesn't meet is because they are a court AF and there's no ambiguity as to the agent of the plan or any possible claim that the plan could go through Congress. You'll see this in some college speech documents, in some more advanced high school speech documents. I'd say the violation exists most of the time, but sometimes it can be implicit. After that, you have the standards or the reasons to prefer. And this is, in this 1 and C, it's just under the header of vote neg. And then they say 1, limits, and 2, ground. Those are reasons why your interpretation is good. And there are a number of different standards that the negative can cite. And you can think of standards as similar to impact arguments. They are reasons that your interpretation's good that later on in the debate that later on in the debate you're going to say are more important than the reasons why the affirmative interpretation is good. And then the fourth component of topicality is the voting issue, which in this debate, or in this 1 and C, it simply says vote neg. In most situations, the 1 and C does not enumerate reasons why topicality is a voting issue. Perhaps 10 or 20 years ago in many places, or perhaps where you're debating now, it is common for the 1 and C to say topicality is a voting issue. It's a jurisdictional a priori issue. If you want to say that, there's absolutely nothing wrong with saying that. But in most instances, that part is left implicit and can be spoken to later if it is questioned by the affirmative. And the reason for that is in debates involving plans and teams that are attempting to be topical, it is most often an assumed, agreed upon notion that topicality is a voting issue, and so it is duplicative and just unnecessary to state that fact in any depth. Instead, you can just do what I did in this 1C, which is to say vote neg. All right, so moving on to a more in-depth discussion of the standards for topicality. And this, again, this is probably things that you are aware of already, but I want to make sure everyone's on the same page. Here are a few different standards that teams could introduce for why topicality is good. The most frequent one that is discussed by the negative is limits. And this is mentioned in this example here, limits. Limits are a way of the neg saying that their interpretation of the topic produces a smaller set of possible topical affirmatives than any alternative understanding of what the topic could be. And the reason for setting a smaller limit on the number of topical affirmatives is that it produces a more manageable research burden for the negative, which allows the negative to be more prepared for going into any debate that they have, because they're more able to research all the possible affirmatives in depth before the debate begins. You can think about limits like setting a Venn diagram where there's a bubble of all the possible affirmatives, and any affirmative that is non-topical falls outside of that bubble. When you're talking about limits, you're talking about constricting the size of the topic, setting a narrower scope for what constitutes topical action. And most of the time, the negative team is going to be defending having a narrower topic because that's better for them from a research perspective. And it's also better for them in that it excludes more affirmative cases, thus making topicality a viable negative argument against more topical cases. And then you're going to see the affirmative saying that the topic should be broader, and they're going to be using terms like flexibility, creativity, or innovation as reasons why the topic should be bigger rather than smaller. Limits is the most classical reason to prefer. It is in its most essential sense the reason why topicality exists as an argument is to define a scope for the topic in order to set the bounds on what can be discussed. I see that there is a question from Michelle, which is, what if the AF is untopical but popular and researched? Should you concede the interpretation and argue the limits? I would say that this falls within some of the other standards that I'm going to be talking about. Limits are not the end-all, be-all of what could constitute the best interpretation. There are other reasons that one may want to include or exclude a particular affirmative, and whether an affirmative is popular and well-researched or has a lot of literature relating to it could impact the desirability of including it within the topic, but for reasons that are entirely unrelated to how large or small the topic is, and that falls within some of the other reasons to prefer or other standards. Limits is, as I've said, it commonly is the case that the negative is defending a strict limit and the affirmative is kind of defending a broader limit. And limits for a lot of judges are a very, very important argument for understanding topicality because it explains the function of topicality. One of the primary functions is simply to demarcate what is and is not topical by setting a bound, which then allows the negative to begin the process of research. Some of the other possible reasons to prefer would include ground. Ground refers to the types of arguments that are available to the affirmative and to the negative under each team's interpretation of the topic. So, for example, if one team's interpretation is that criminal justice reform must be comprehensive, a huge overhaul of the entire criminal justice system, then that naturally allows the negative links to every sort of criminal justice reform DA about how it exists right now. Like, for example, DOJ overstretch, the politics disadvantage, the elections disadvantage. Any of these broad-ranging DAs are going to link if the affirmative must be comprehensive. If instead the affirmative can be a minor change to any one aspect of sentencing or policing policy, then perhaps those arguments would not apply. And so the negative can say that their ground is compromised if the affirmative can be a subset rather than a comprehensive component. Ground refers to the arguments that are available, and teams will want to say that predictable, high quality, and just the quantity of ground available to them is important for fairness. A third standard is education. I think this gets to what Michelle was talking about, which is there are some cases that intuitively people would say, this feels like it is a central component of the topic that we should include, regardless of the merits of how big or small the topic would be as a result of including it. And it may just be the case that based on the way that the literature is constructed, there's tons of articles about a certain case or certain affirmative area. Let's say, for example, that everyone's consensus opinion is that the death penalty is a core aspect of criminal justice reform, and it would be an absolute travesty of mistake of the community to exclude death penalty cases from being debated as part of criminal justice reform. That might fall within the area of education. The affirmative or the negative would say, our interpretation is most educational because it accesses areas of the topic that have the highest quality literature, that are the most timely, that are the ones that have the most controversy related to them, all producing debates that have a high pedagogical value for their participants. To go back to something that Michelle asked, which is to say, what if the affirmative is not topical, but popular and researched? I would say that the way that is phrased, blurs the lines a little bit between topicality and the concept of limits. When we're talking about education and the reasons to include or exclude a particular affirmative, by their very nature, if we're saying that the death penalty is a core, controversial, highly educational part of criminal justice reform, then those are arguments why that case should be considered to be topical, even though it may not be included within the negative's definition. So there's a slight difference between it is not topical and it is not included within the negative's definition of a topic term. And then I would say a fourth common standard is precision. And this one sometimes confuses people a little bit, because if you go back to what I said about topicality being about what the topic should mean versus what the topic does mean, precision gets close to saying, here is what the topic does mean. When people are making arguments about precision, they are saying that there is a singular definition of a topic term that is just more factually correct than others. For example, like in a certain situation, our definition of in here is from a court case that has intent to define and is from expert judges in the context of attempting to define the scope of law, which is an analogy to this topic, and defines both in the United States in a holistic fashion. You'd be in effect, by making your arguments about precision, you'd be attempting to say that as a matter of factual correctness, there's just a simple, more right way of understanding the topic than others, which it does not mean that there's simply one possible definition of the topic. Again, you are acknowledging that there could be alternative constructions of meaning, but you're saying that one is just right and one is wrong for whatever reasons that you would like to be introducing. Before I move on to some intermediate topics, I want to mention that there are a couple other issues that come up as it relates to topicality that I wouldn't say are necessarily just reasons to prefer, but they are terms that kind of float around that could be related, that could relate to the reasons to prefer that I mentioned before. And I want to make sure that everyone understands what those words mean. First is bidirectionality. You might have heard this term used before. What bidirectionality means is that one team's interpretation makes the topic bidirectional, meaning that it can operate in both directions. For example, if criminal justice reform could mean to either change by making more restrictive or change by making less restrictive, then the topic, in a sense, it becomes bidirectional, in the sense that teams could change sentencing laws to make them more strict, to make them more tough on crime, to make it more law and order, or criminal justice reform could be less restrictive to make it less tough on crime, to reduce sentencing, to make it softer on crime. Typically, arguments about bidirectionality are used to say that bidirectionality is bad. Usually the negative is saying it is an undesirable thing if the topic becomes bidirectional. And the reason for that is unidirectionality establishes a general theme for negative ground that creates a predictable set of arguments that the negative could use. For example, if the topic has to only be making sentencing less restrictive, softer on crime, it has to, if the topic has to rein in the scope of policing, that, or rein in the scope of forensic science, then the negative gets disadvantages that are related to, making, like, for example, the negative will get politics links about being soft on crime, about reducing the current harshness of the current system. If the affirmative can read cases that are in both directions, for example, they can either eliminate the death penalty or they can apply the death penalty in more cases, like, for example, apply the death penalty in more cases related to federal drug trafficking or terrorism or whatnot, then the negative is essentially forced to debate against both both extremes, and they have to double the amount of generic research that they have to produce. And so it's kind of it's an argument about limits, and it's an argument about ground, and it can be used in either of those instances. Second, a concept that comes up related to topicality that I wouldn't say is necessarily a standard, but is a theme, is the notion of predictability. And you'll hear this come up in relation to limits, like predictable limits, or in relation to ground, like predictable ground. Predictability refers to the negative's ability or the affirmative's ability to understand what the topic means in advance. And one could say that someone has a more limiting or less limiting interpretation, but that interpretation is not predictable at all because any number of reasons. Like, for example, the evidence that they're using to define their interpretation is not in the context of criminal justice reform, or not in the context of U.S. law, or it's using a term in a very non-common sense, non-standard way that one or either team would not likely be able to predict in advance. And I think I'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, I'm going to move on to some intermediate concepts about talking about extending topicality. So my comments so far have just been related to the foundations of understanding what topicality is. This is going to relate a little bit more to the notion about how to get a little bit better at extending topicality if you already understand those things. When I talk to students, a lot of people are afraid of extending topicality, but really shouldn't be. They feel as though extending T in the 2 and R and just going for T feels a little bit riskier than extending, say, for example, the state's counterplan in politics. They feel as though they're going out on a little bit more of a limb, that they've put all of their eggs in just the topicality basket, and it feels like it's a little bit unfamiliar terrain. Or they might feel as though they don't have as much experience with topicality as they have with other policy arguments. And as a result of that, they are less willing to extend topicality than they otherwise would be. I'm here to try to dispel those notions. For one, it is risky no matter what argument you go for in the 2 and R. Your chances of winning are not guaranteed by any means if you were to go for states and politics. It just feels a little bit riskier than what it may feel if you were to go for something that you're more familiar with, but it doesn't mean that it's actually safer. And like anything, your confidence level will grow with experience, and you don't really want to create a self-fulfilling prophecy where you don't go for topicality because you haven't gone for topicality in the past, thus making it so you don't feel like you have the experience in order to go for it in the future, even though it might be the best argument or the argument that gives you the highest chance of winning in a future situation. And so, especially at camp now, when the debates that you're having are relatively low stakes, the practice debates that you have are not going to impact your chances to achieve your goals over the course of the season. Now is the time to experiment with arguments that you don't typically go for. Like, for example, if you don't typically go for the critique, now's the time to practice going for that. If you don't typically go for topicality, now's the time to practice going for topicality, and try to get a few reps under your belt now on arguments that you don't normally have. I see that there's a question here from Zach that says, should teams expect to come across an AF argument that is tough on crime, or will most be softer on crime? That is a good question. I think that would be a good one to bring to your lab leaders later. I don't know the truth of the topicality like evidence as to whether it is feasible to exclude the affirmatives that try to be tougher on crime. But I would say that you should be aware that that is at least a possibility, that criminal justice reform could be bidirectional, and that crafty affirmative teams might try to take advantage of that by going the other way during the season. And that if you, like, when I talk to my teams before the start of our season, I usually tell them that going into the start of the season, that you should have a concept in your mind for what you think the topic means. And anything that you think within that you think falls within the notion of what the topic means, you should be able to beat on substance. And anything that you think does not fall within what the topic means, you should be able to beat on topicality. So if you go to your first tournament of the year and you think that you are prepared to beat any AF that becomes more soft on crime based on substance, but you don't really have strategies against AFs that are tough on crime, you need to be prepared in order to go for and beat those teams on topicality, or you need to do the work in the preseason to beat them on substance as well. If you don't think that those AFs are topical, you need to be able to prove it by getting good at going for topicality. Here are, in order to be competent at extending topicality in the 2NC, one really fortunate thing about topicality is that for the most part is that it is a contained and solved game. And what I mean by that is, if you've ever played tic-tac-toe, you might know that if you're playing optimal tic-tac-toe strategy, the game always ends in a draw. There's no way to win tic-tac-toe if both teams are playing as well as they possibly can. That is the definition of a solved game. You can go through the decision tree of every possible move, every possible counter move, all the way down to the game. And if you were to program it into an advanced supercomputer, it would tell you that every game ends in a draw. I believe that checkers has also been entirely solved by computers, and computers are getting better and better at solving games like chess that I discussed yesterday, or Go, or other board games. Topicality in some ways is a bit more of a solved game than other arguments that exist within debate. And that is for the reason that there's only usually so many arguments that can be made in any given topicality debate that you, as the negative, have the ability to manage, prepare, block out, and make it so that there are certain arguments that are relatively easy for you to extend. And here's a quick sheet, like a cheat sheet for you, of the 5 blocks that you need to have when you are extending topicality. And if you have these 5 blocks, you will be good to go in almost all situations when extending almost any topicality argument that you have. They are your overview, your violation, your answers to their counterinterpretation, answers to AF flexibility, and answers to education. Those are the 5 blocks: overview, violation, answers to counterinterpretation, answers to AF flexibility, answers to education. If you have those 5 blocks, it will take care of the vast majority of affirmative arguments that they potentially could read against topicality. And if you prepare them in the pre-round, you'll be able to extend topicality without spending almost any negative prep time, or very little negative prep time, in order to extend it. If you look at the topicality file that I sent out, I'm going to quickly flip over to share that with you all, so that way we're looking at the same thing here. Sorry, I'm trying to share with you the T file. Doesn't look like I'm going to be able to. A little tech fail. But if you look at the Topicality arms control file that I sent out, you'll notice that there's some key 2NC blocks. Under the 2NC header, there's arms control overview 2NC, and it's basically written out. You'll see that there's the violation 2NC. You'll see there's answers to counterinterpretation 2NC. And then you'll see that there are answers to app flexibility, answers to education, and then a few other smaller blocks. This is not to say that you only ever need 5 blocks, but if you did only have those 5 blocks, that would cover the large majority of things that the affirmative team could potentially say. If you are looking at the file, I would recommend that you click on T arms control overview 2NC now, because I'm going to talk about how to master giving topicality overviews, and this will give you a little example to look at. I'm just going to go back to sharing this one, the 1NC that we were looking at before. Mastering overviews. There is a relatively clear formula for topicality overviews that is really easy to memorize, that will work for you in almost all situations. Debate never is that clean. It never provides rules that always work, but this can provide you with a guide that will work most of the time for you. You start with saying our interpretation is X. So our interpretation is that enact only means Congress. Then you say they don't meet it because Y. So our interpretation is X. Our interpretation is enact means Congress. They don't meet it because they're the court. They don't meet it because Y. Then you say that destroys Z, and Z is whatever your most important reason to prefer is. So you'd say our interpretation is that enact means only congressional action. They don't meet it because they're the court. That destroys limits, or in other instances, it could be ground or whatever. And then you say Z outweighs. So limits outweighs. So again, just repeating the formula, I would recommend that you type this down. It is good almost all the time. Is our interpretation is X. They don't meet it because Y. That destroys Z, and Z outweighs. And if you're looking at the topicality file that I had sent out, this overview roughly uses that method. It starts by saying arms control is a limit on the number and type of weapons, which is a way of saying our interpretation is X. Then it says they don't meet it because, and then it has a little thing where it's like highlighted and says fill in the blank because it depends on the given debate. Then it says it's a voting issue for limits, which is a way of saying that destroys limits, and then has some explanation of what that is, and then says limits outweigh, and then does what I would refer to as topicality impact calculus, where it explains that limits is the most important issue. In 90+% of the time, if you write your topicality overviews using that exact formula, you can literally just fill in the blanks for X, Y, and Z. You will have reasonably good topicality overviews. For your block to answer counterinterpretations, let's flip to the section that's under the header of counterinterpretation, and then you'll see a header that's called T arms control answers to counterinterpretation 2NC. There's a formula for writing these type of blocks, which is you should have some or all of the following things. Number one, if they don't meet their counterinterpretation, you should say they don't meet their own counterinterpretation. this goes back to the thing that I was mentioning with the tactic before. It's not in this block because I'm assuming that most teams would be meeting their counter interpretation. But if they're doing that, then it should be one of the first things that you say on the counter interpretation. You want to extend your original standard and mention the fact that their interpretation undermines that standard. Then you should develop a second standard, which is probably going to be something that was mentioned in the 1NC, but may not have been something that's mentioned in the overview. In this instance, the standard that's mentioned in the overview is limits, and the second standard that's mentioned in the 2NC is ground, the ground DA. Then you should introduce so you want to introduce a second standard and develop it and make sure that you impact that standard. In this case, it's developed with a further explanation than what was provided in the 1NC, and then there's the statement, core ground is key to fairness, which is a way of saying fairness, or that ground matters. And then you want to introduce any additional reasons to prefer your interpretation. And you can literally go through the list of all the things that I mentioned to you before. You can go through things like ground, education, precision, bidirectionality, predictability. Any one of those could apply, and your goal in the negative block is to introduce as many new reasons to prefer your interpretation as possible. It's the same as when you are in the negative and you're extending a disadvantage and you're reading new impact modules to your DA. That's always a good thing. If the 2EC is reading impact D to economic decline to your politics DA, you might want to read a US-China war impact to the politics DA. That way you have another impact if they take out the economy impact. The same concept is true for topicality as well. If they have defense against limits, you want to add in ground or education or predictability. You want to add in other reasons to prefer. And then you can, in addition to this, if you want to get really fancy, you can read additional violations, definitions of new words that they don't meet that are separate from your 1NC interpretation. Let's go back to the T argument about criminal justice reform being comprehensive. If criminal justice reform is comprehensive, is defined in the 1NC, let's say, for example, you're defining criminal justice reform, and the evidence just says the term criminal justice reform refers to an overhaul of the entire criminal justice system. You might read, in the negative block, you might read additional definitions of words within the topic that support the idea that the affirmative must be comprehensive. For example, you could read a definition of the word in to say in must mean throughout, as an additional reason why the affirmative has to act throughout the criminal justice system of the United States. And in that instance, the utility of reading additional definitions is not only are you adding in the element that your interpretation is more holistic, it assumes the entire scope of all the resolutional words together, but you're adding an additional trick, which is that the affirmative needs to then answer that interpretation by providing a counter interpretation of that word in the 1AR, in addition to answering your original interpretation. The reason for that is, let's say the 2AC had just counter-interpreted criminal justice reform, but they did not counter-interpret in the 1AR. Then there would be an uncontested interpretation of the topic, which is that in means throughout, meaning the entire part. And so even if criminal justice reform includes only some parts, it still must be throughout the United States because that is the meaning of the word in. And so the negative would still have the only possible interpretation of the topic. I understand that this is a little bit more of an intermediate or advanced concept. It's something to talk with your lab leaders about later, but you should just know that you can develop your argument by adding additional definitions as the debate goes on. I wanted to talk about a concept, another intermediate concept that comes up sometimes, which is referred to as functional limits. It might be a term that you've heard before, but I wanted to make sure that everyone understood it. When I discussed limits before, what I was referring to is strict or nominal limits, which refers to purely the number of cases that are theoretically allowed under either team's interpretation. So, for example, in the case of like the United States means the United States of America, and you should not allow cases that affect other countries' criminal justice reform. The negative is saying, well, it's key to limits because otherwise you multiply every AF by 195 countries of the world, and so there's 195 versions of every affirmative. That's referring to theoretical limits. Like theoretically, there's the Luxembourg equivalent of every affirmative. There's the Australia equivalent of every affirmative. There's the South Africa equivalent of every affirmative, and so on. What functional limits is referring to is how many AFs will exist under either team's interpretation in practice. Meaning not just on paper, but in reality, when the debates actually play out, how many affirmatives will actually be read? And that question is answered by some combination of how many advantages are there, how strategic are those affirmatives, how much literature is there to support them, and how good are the negative generics at limiting out various affirmatives. So usually functional limits is a concept that is brought up by the affirmative that is defense against theoretical or nominal limits, where the affirmative says that there's not really very much limits explosion under their interpretation because functional limits check. And what the affirmative is saying in that instance is that there are other variables that will prevent there being a large number of cases read that constrain the affirmative other than purely the definitions of words within the topic. For example, the existence of the state's counterplan limits out a large number of cases because many of them don't have any federal key warrant. Or the lack of literature for cases means that there's hardly any AFs that will be read within certain areas of the topic. There won't be an AF that's just about reforming the criminal justice system within Guam, for example, because there's just not enough literature out there to support that affirmative. Someone asked the question, what part of topicality can you not lose? What part is most important? Well, that's kind of like asking what part of a disadvantage can you not lose or what part of disadvantage is most important. They're all, from the negative perspective, they are all equally important. You need to win each and every component of it. But when it comes to reasons to prefer, just like when you're negative, when you are going for a disadvantage, the affirmative can win some portions of your case, and you can win by just having your disadvantage outweigh the case. When you're going for topicality, they can win some amount of their reasons to prefer, but you can just outweigh. It then goes back to the impact calculus that one might do as to how limits are more important than affirmative flexibility or related or more important than ground. Richard asks, how can you impact out precision or predictability when your evidence for the counterinterpretation is more precise than the affirmatives? Well, for each one of these things, we want to think about them in terms of the most common theory impacts that exist within debate. And usually those fall within either the area of fairness or they fall within the area of education. When you really drill down to the bottom level of the topicality or theory well. And with both precision and predictability, you want to eventually get to one or both of them. And so, for example, you can say precision is critical to topic education because any learning that we get about criminal justice reform must be accurate for it to have any value. Anything that we learn about the meaning of this topic that is distorted because it is not relying upon the expert consensus of the meaning of certain terms just doesn't have as much utility pedagogically for us. And so it acts as an education impact. Or you could say it's key to fairness because precision, the accurate and singular meaning of a term, the consensus or expert reading of that term, it guides negative research. Almost everyone approaches researching the topic assuming that sentencing reform means a certain thing, because that is simply that is the precise and accurate way of understanding it, which then dictates uh, the arguments that are available to the negative, which are critical to fairness, and then you then get to that terminal impact. And so it's about connecting those concepts all the way down. And the most important thing that I could say there, and you can take for the future and work with your lab leaders on, is in the negative block, when you're answering their counterinterpretation, when you're introducing additional standards, you need to make sure that with every standard you introduce, you also include an impact for that standard. So you not only say their interpretation is unpredictable, or their interpretation undermines ground, or their interpretation is uneducational, but you also, as you say that and conclude that statement, you say that matters. Precision outweighs, predictability outweighs, etc. And if you look in the example file that I sent you, there's some different ways that this is done. I think if you control F in the file for precision outweighs, you can find an example of a card that I cut for the space topic, of which I'm sure there are similar cards for the criminal justice reform topic, that basically says that in this field, accurate terminology is very important for, in the context of space. I think it was talking about like scientific literacy. In the area of criminal justice reform, we're naturally talking about an area of law. And so in the area of law, the meaning of words in the precise use of words is incredibly important. And so I'm sure that you can find some evidence if you just research like the importance of terminological accuracy or precise terminology, or you look at glossaries that were written for the field and you look in the preface to them where people talk about the reason why glossary exists. They'll usually explain why it is important that there's common terminology within the field to avoid misunderstandings, given that given that important issues sometimes pivot on minor differences in terms in the context of criminal law or in the context of criminal justice reform. And so you can, not only can you make arguments about why predictability or precision outweigh, but you can actually cut evidence and then read cards to support this. And this is another thing that I think you might notice if you look at the file that I sent out, is just how card heavy it is as opposed to analytic heavy. And that might be a little bit of a stylistic difference between college debate and the circuit of debate that you exist in. But I would at least recommend to you that you think about whether there's evidence that you could cut to support the arguments that you're making with topicality, that it's not just all things that are being made up off the cuff. You don't actually need to read all the evidence all the time. In fact, sometimes you can cut the card, have it available, but decide to paraphrase it in the moment as opposed to reading it. But having cut the evidence will give you the idea that will allow you to better phrase your argument and improve your analytic. And also you'll have the card there that you can potentially use in the future if you wanted to. I'm gonna show one more example, hopefully, if I can get the old screen share to cooperate with me. And then I'm going to wrap up here today. All right, so here is a sample 1NC. And hopefully this is a time when I'm hoping that I could get some feedback from you all and some thoughts from you all. So take a moment and look at this 1NC. Presume that this is the actual 1NC that someone has read against you. And let's say that your AF is policing reform, and the negative stands up and they read exactly this. They say, interpretation, the only topical, looks like they have a typo. The only topical cases are ones that eliminate the death penalty. The plan is not the death penalty. Then there's like vote neg, one limits. It's obvious. They allow all the different types of criminal justice reform. That's a huge category. We only allow the death penalty. And so we have a much, much more narrow limit than the affirmative. And then they say ground. We like get death penalty good DAs, which is something that we can research in advance. If you were to debate this, or if you were to see this 1NC being read, you might notice that there are some things about this that are different than the average topicality violation that you might see. what is different about this 1NC, and what is your reaction to this if you were facing it on the affirmative side? It doesn't have a card, says Callie. Absolutely. Almost all 1NCs have a card to support their interpretation. Ned says there's no interpretation card, which makes it really easy to answer. Okay, for the people who think it's really easy to answer, what is the really easy answer to make because they do not have a card for their interpretation? Richard says it's unpredictable and arbitrary. Remy says it's not grounded in the literature. Kay Baylor says we can say our interpretation is more credible. Anyone else have any thoughts? It does have to do with the fact that there is no card. The negative interpretation is just being made up by them. In fact, it's probably pretty unlikely that there's any evidence out there that says criminal justice reform is limited only to changing the death penalty. And also, it's kind of like implied by the resolution that has different areas that are like, it's more than just sentencing. It says like police reform and forensic science, which kind of implies that you could be more than just the death penalty. But if you think about the way that some people think about topicality, where they just think, okay, topicality is about setting the most limiting interpretation, and it doesn't really matter how you go about doing that. The point is just to establish the smallest topic because limits are good. This would be good at doing that. This does set a very narrow limit. Only the death penalty is topical. It is the only case that you can read. You cannot read any other cases other than eliminating the death penalty. It is by definition the most narrow case. Any other case that is not the death penalty is excluded. And then they'll just be like, oh, well, limits outweigh. Boom, 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 boom. Just like all the walks you've ever seen, all the judges you've ever heard be like, oh, well, limits, just the most important thing. When we're affirmative, how do we defeat that? How do we defeat the fact that the negative is, if the negative has the power to craft their own interpretation without requiring any evidence, they are going to be able to come up with an interpretation that is more limiting than yours. I guarantee it. This is an example, but there are endless other examples that one could cite. Holland says, what's the point of having a resolution if the neg can just say it means anything? Well, I guess the negative would be saying the point of it is to establish a limit. That way, the negative doesn't have to prepare for very many things. And the negative can, and if the topic is just the death penalty, then the limit is set very small. Holland goes on to say they can just shift the goalpost every debate. That is true. Let's say they were to read this interpretation where they say the only topical cases are the ones that eliminate the death penalty. Then next debate, you read the death penalty. That's your F. Then the negative says our interpretation, the only topical cases are the ones that restrict search and seizure by the police. It's more limiting because it eliminates all other types of criminal justice reform, and the AF interpretation includes all, it includes the death penalty, but includes a whole bunch of other stuff. So exactly, they change the goalposts, and they're always going to be able to exclude your case. The point is that something has to be prior to limits, conceptually. Otherwise, we go down this rabbit hole, which this example, which you've probably not seen before, but you've not seen before for a reason, it illustrates through exaggeration and hyperbole. It's the extreme version of that logic. But the point is that arbitrary interpretations are bad, regardless of whether they are more limiting than some other interpretation. Because once they become arbitrary, then they are unpredictable for the reasons that everyone has identified here. And the limit that they have is essentially self-serving, which is the argument that Holland just made, which is that the negative can, if the negative is allowed to introduce arbitrary or contrived interpretations that are not grounded in topic literature to exclude the AF but set a better limit, then the negative will always be able to come up with a slightly more limiting interpretation that excludes the affirmative. And this comes up even in situations where the negative team has read evidence. It most often comes up where the negative team reads evidence, but the evidence doesn't accurately match what their interpretation says. And I guess I lied. I'm going to do one other thing. I realize I'm going slightly over time. I've gone 5 minutes over time. This will only take me one minute, but I'm going to pull up this example. And this is an example of a card that people read for topicality enact that is a common T argument. It is from a different camp that you may be able to intuit what the name of the camp is, but I will leave their name out in order to protect the innocent. But this evidence says the common usage of the term enact does not generally mean the actions of the court. Then says it's not that limited. Then says executive agencies are frequently empowered to adopt rules. And then says enact and adopt must be read to contemplate different things. This evidence is being used to say that that enactment cannot be the courts. How would the affirmative, I've pointed out some examples of this, but how would the affirmative indict this evidence and this interpretation as being arbitrary? How could they make a similar claim? And again, saying an interpretation is arbitrary is to say that their interpretation is not grounded in evidence, that their interpretation is being made up by the negative, that there's a disjunct between what the negative's evidence says and what their interpretation says. Georgiana has it exactly. Generally, and frequently are the words that their evidence use, but that is not always the case, which is not the same thing as saying the term enact cannot mean that. It just means that it usually does not, but the negative's interpretation is that enact cannot mean the courts. And so there's a little bit of a gap. There's a little bit of daylight in between their interpretation and what their evidence says. And as the affirmative team, you want to say that that daylight is a contrivance. It is an arbitrary interpretation of what their evidence says that is made up by the negative in order to purposefully exclude the affirmative. And then it's no different than the example that I've already presented about, only the death penalty is topical. It is unpredictable and can always be generated in order to exclude the affirmative. All right, I've already gone a little bit over my time. I hope that some of this has helped you all to learn a little bit about topicality. I definitely have more things that I could say about topicality that perhaps we could go over at a later time, but I don't want to hold you any longer. Thank you all for being so attentive, listening, and tuning in. I've really enjoyed getting the opportunity to talk to you all today and yesterday, and really hope that you all have a great time the rest of your time here at the camp.